A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Well, Greg Bondar is National Spokesperson for Christian Voice Australia, a national think tank and advocacy group for families, liberty and faith. Greg Bondar, a special welcome back to 2020.
Oh, delighted to be here, Neil. Thank you for the invitation.
Hey, Greg, we're going to be talking about the Anglican Church, and we're going to be talking about some declining numbers. And before anyone jumps to a conclusion that somehow or other we're going to be beating up on the church, I wonder if you've got a thought here, because a very honest report that you've been looking through. What are your thoughts around, how you think about talking about some declining numbers?
Yeah, thank you, Neil. Look, this report actually came out of the 53rd Synod meeting in 2023, and I used to sit on the Anglican Synod, the Sydney Anglican Synod, some years ago. But this report came out as a result of that request by the Synod to have a report come forward to analyse the average attendance trend and the assessment of social changes upon attendance. Now, I have to congratulate the Anglican Church, Neil, because it may be the Anglican Church report, but I can tell you now, Neil, this applies to the Baptists, the Presbyterians, doesn't matter who it is, because the report is so reflective of what is happening in our churches today.
And Greg, no doubt some of the findings in the report might be a little skewed because of COVID. And I know that the National Church Life Survey wasn't as well represented in the last one as what it had been in earlier ones. And so some of the numbers might be a little bit skewed in that because, there was a dramatic challenge to church attendance through COVID. And that did have a big difference.
Yeah, absolutely, Neil. In actual fact, the National Church Life Survey showed that there was a steady decline in the number of new attendees, Neil, people that came to church for the first time. And it fell from, in 2001, there used to be around about 12% of new attendees. And in 2021, Neil, it fell down to 5.4%. So there is a COVID factor there, but still it's indicating now the drop of new people coming to church, which is and that's reflected in the Anglican report as well.
Okay, so the report reflects on adult attendance in churches and primarily in Sydney. So this is not a national type of review, is it? And maybe there's some national reflection in there, but give us the hard news that came out in this report.
Yeah, Neil, I think this is absolutely fantastic report because it's actually going to highlight the issues that we as Christians, one, and two, as Christian churches are going to have to address. Because what's happening is, and when I read the report, I said, wow, I'm not surprised by some of the findings, but here they are, Neil, and you might like to sort of reflect on this. But in particular, one of the things that came out was that there were churches that were growing primarily at the expense of churches that were declining. So in other words, there was a real drop in churches growing, but some of them have been growing because of the closure of other churches. I know in our own church, Neil, that I attend, we actually merged with another church because the demographics wouldn't allow us to continue on a sustainable footing. So that's one of the things that came out. The other thing that came out was that the reason, and I'll get to it more in a moment, but the reason for the noticeable decline, Neil, has been due to secularisation. And I don't think you're surprised by that either, Neil.
No, in fact, one of the things I like to reflect on, those things that are happening that change the view of people about the world, and church, yes, is affected by that, and that's why you've got to be very careful to navigate your way through a secularisation that might be happening so that you don't get waylaid and taken off track and lose your direction. And so you've identified, or this report has identified, the sorts of factors that have contributed to decline and growth. And one of those, as you say, secularisation. But what else is in there, those factors contributing?
Yeah, no, Neil, I have to make the point, I think you already mentioned this. Don't forget, we're talking about the Sydney Diocese, right? but I think it's reflective, both nationally and even globally, and I'll get to that in a moment. But the report is saying that there are now fewer larger churches, and the larger churches declined at a greater rate than the medium to smaller churches, number one. Here are some other factors, Neil, that I think are absolutely fascinating, is that the overall increase in secularisation in Australia has been growing. The historical church over the last 100. Now, Neil, you know this, but I'll repeat it anyway. 1911, there were 96% of the population identified as Christian. 1971, 86% identified as Christian, and our last survey, 2021, only 43.9% identified as Christian. Now, I do have a reason for that, and one of them is that, don't forget, Neil, that the census now doesn't require you. It's not compulsory to answer that question. But apart from that, you can see there is a rapid decline, Neil.
Okay, yes, there's all sorts of factors, including the way the census questions look as to how people respond, and that might even skew actual numbers too. And no doubt there'll be people who are listening saying, hang on a second, our church is booming, our church is growing. But others, as you'll appreciate, and, you know, there are somewhere between, I think, 11 and 15,000 churches around Australia. And some are growing, some are shrinking. And there might be all sorts of reasons for that. You know, we talk about the rise in secularism, Greg, all sorts of issues around migration and globalisation and a lot of other factors in there. How do you reflect on those?
Yeah, when I read the report, Neil, it was interesting that they actually analysed the rise in secularism, which we know is happening, but then they drilled down a bit further and found out that social changes such as migration and globalisation, legal access to gambling. You know, I've always been an anti-gambling advocate. You know, no, I mean, a pro anti-gambling. In other words, I don't like gambling because it does skew the young people.
Okay,
and
just hold up for a sec there, Greg, because interesting when you mention this, because there's a lot of things you can say are competitors of the church. And as you start to go through some of these reasonings, some of the, you know, the reason for the rise in secularism, these sorts of things, yes, gambling becomes one of those. People spending money in a different way than what they ordinarily would if they didn't have access to those gambling opportunities. What else is on the list?
Just on that gambling, Neil, see, I read a recent report in the USA where the cost of living has now impacted people. They are going to gambling and they're not donating to their church. So gambling is a big factor. The other ones include, Neil, pornography, abortion, voluntary assisted dying, increased gender fluidity, especially amongst the youth. And the last one there is one, the LGBTIQA lifestyles. All these social factors, Neil, have indicated that people are moving away from the church, becoming more secularised, and these are partly responsible for the decline in church attendance. And I'll come to some economic ones in a moment.
While you identify things like pornography, that would be connected too with the major advances in technology. The increase in accessibility of pornography clearly contributes into there, and people access the pornography, they feel a sense of shame, and the shame keeps them away from church. Now, that's an interesting development in that, but so far as the technology goes, all the online stuff, and now AI is upon us. What other social changes can you identify, or does this report look at?
Yeah, the technology, as you mentioned, is you see, I do a lot of talks at men's breakfast, and I talk to a lot of men's group. As you know, I do a lot of chaplaincy work apart from my preaching. But Neil, you know, the number one issue for men is still pornography. Yeah, it's still one of the number issue that drives away from the church. So it's interesting that access to AI, technology is one. So other things include cyberbullying. The economic trends include, we now work 24/7, so that drags us away from the church. The traditional jobs have now gone nil, the 9 till 5. Then the cost of housing, rising homelessness, drags it away from the church. And finally, which is very interesting, Neil, the breakdown of the family unit is also dragging you away from the church. So these are real critical issues, and I think it was wonderful for the Anglican Church to be able to identify this, because now it has something to address and to try and reverse the decline in attendance.
And for that, coming back to our initial introduction, we'll congratulate the Anglican Church for this sort of ability to be so transparent. And here we are talking about it, and there'll be people who are saying, oh, of course, and pointing a finger at Anglican churches. Well, let's not be into finger pointing. Let's be celebratory of the fact that these things are being addressed, and they are major issues, not just for the Anglican Church, but lots of other churches. Hey, there's something in the report, the mays and the may nots. Parishes that may not have been as active as others. How does this get reflected in the report?
Yeah, look, I have to again say that I'm impressed by the church in actually mentioning the issues that a lot of people try and hide away from, especially in the church structure. The report clearly says that in addressing complex contemporary issues, also includes child sexual abuse, family and domestic violence, identity issues, divorce and remarriage. But it says, Neil, that some of the parishes may not have been as active as other parishes in addressing these issues. In other words, if you try and avoid them, overlook them, then they're going to drag people away from the church, because, parishes need to address child abuse, family, domestic violence, identity, divorce, remarriage, and if you don't address them, you'll lose your congregation, Neil.
Sometimes people reflect on the long, very drawn-out Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse, and the sorts of stigma that came around leaders in churches. Does the report reflect on those sorts of issues?
Absolutely. The report makes it clear that the other possible impacts on why there's been a decline in church attendance has been the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse, and I think that was a very great initiative. But the other things that came out was the same-sex marriage plebiscite, which you would remember, Neil, and I remember at the time when this was being proposed, I said, this is going to drag people away from the church if it passes. And I don't want to call myself a prophet, but it's happened, Neil. People have moved away because of this. And finally, Neil, there's been a lack of biblical teaching on human sexuality accompanying the public debate on same-sex marriage. So, Neil, it's wonderful that the church has identified this, because, as I said, it now gives them a clear mandate as to what needs to be addressed to bring people back to church.
You'll know, as I often say, Greg, it's a miracle that the church even exists at all. And some of the things that have come out in this report and all of those different dimensions, you might even be saying, well, it's amazing that the church is still surviving, because some people would say, well, all of those reasons are a great reason not to be in church. Well, it might be putting the shoe on the other foot and saying all of those reasons are the reason why we need to be back in church, because this is not just a leadership issue. This is for people who are in congregations to be able to discern these times and to recognise what God has put in place. I mean, he's put a stake in the ground. It's called the local church. It's the body of Christ. These things are important for us to reflect on, aren't they?
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely, Neil. And this is the wonderful part about this report, that it's so good when you can do some navel gazing, Neil, because it tells you, hey, here are the issues. What are we going to do about them? And I know from my own point of view that from wearing my other hat at Every Home for Christ, it now gives us a real indication as to how we connect with the churches, Neil. So I think it's a wonderful report, and I think we've got to be on the lookout for the increase in secularism. And what are the reasons for them? Well, we've discussed those, Neil. And I think that's something that we're really going to have to try and do something about it. Not just the church, but we as congregation people that, attend our local Baptist, Anglican, Presbyterian, whatever it might be. Yeah.
And as Anglicans might be taking this personally, we're talking about a report into the Anglican Church and primarily around Sydney. Others who are thinking, well, my church is in decline too. It might be just because there's demographic changes and the people in my church who I love, we've all just grown old together and we don't have any young people to replace us. And that's going to lead to all sorts of things too, and people will reflect poorly on our church, even though it's just the fact that we've grown old. That's another demographic issue too, isn't it, Greg?
Absolutely. The demographics, as I said, our church, where I witness here at southern suburbs of Sydney, our church merged with another church, and it was simply due to demographics and viability. And quite frankly, it has to happen, and churches have merged or folded. And I was in Melbourne yesterday, and I mentioned this to you before, with a lovely church in St Kilda, closed because it can't continue. So yes, there are some real issues here on demographics, Neil. And getting older, I'm still a young fella, Neil, as you can tell. But the time's going to come where I'm going to have a wheelchair to go to church, Neil.
And sometimes, just come back to churches for a few moments here, because some folding, some closing. Well, others are merging and using that as a opportunity for renewal. So don't count the church down for the count. They're not out yet. But there's a big transition, there's change that has to go on in some churches, and while other churches are thriving, there are some that are going through that change, and they all deserve our prayers because every one of those churches is important. In fact, we want to see those churches multiplying. Those might be ones closing, but there's others being planted. We need to see lots more church planting. Hey, speaking of old things, and I know he won't mind me reflecting here. He's getting a little older and talking about demographic change. One of your good mates and someone who has been a champion of Christian faith. Lots of people either love him or hate him, but Fred Nile, he's turning 90. A good mate of yours, and some celebrations on for his birthday.
Neil, good old Fred. Fred John Nile turned 90 on Sunday, 15th of September. And wonderful birthday. He's looking well. He's a little bit frail, but look, Neil, you and I, we've discussed this before, but Fred was the only one in Australia that had a true Christian political party. And you know what? It went, 1981 to 2023, the longest serving member of the upper house in New South Wales. A wonderful person. As I said, you love him or hate him, but quite frankly, the only Christian political party that he headed up, and I was part of that, as you know, as the national director of the Christian Democratic Party for many years. But I was so pleased to see him turning 90. But you know what, Neil, time will come when we're all going to turn 90. Mine's a fair way off yet, Neil. But, he's looking well. And his wife, Silvana, who he married in 2013, and, of course, Elaine Nile was a wonderful woman from 1958 to 2011, was his first wife. But it was a wonderful reflection, and I just hope we can find more Christian politicians that can stand up for their faith in Parliament now.
Yes, and so he's had a 90th birthday, and I might just add, a life well lived, because when you know that you are perhaps, from the public perception, and even Christians thinking of Fred Nile, they might be thinking even negative things, but he was the most reviled person, politician, minister of the gospel, certainly by the LGBT movement that has had such an overwhelming sort of effect in their sort of attack upon the church. But Fred Nile stood firm and has remained faithful to his Lord, Jesus Christ, all through that time. And really, I think he's one of the champions of Christian faith in Australia. And tremendous milestone. Turning 90 years old. We might say a special happy birthday to you, Fred Nile. No doubt he'll either be listening in or he'll get to hear a podcast of this. But Fred Nile, just wonderful life, and we'll honour you from this position here. Hey,
and I just say, well done, good and faithful servant. Now,
great stuff. Hey, to connect with Greg, You'll be able to do that. Greg Bondar's national spokesperson for Christian Voice Australia. He's also wearing the hat Every Home for Christ now too, but if you want to connect with him, and perhaps there'll be something of a blog on this report about the Anglican Church, you'll find that at christianvoiceaustralia.blog. christianvoiceaustralia.blog to connect with Greg Bondar in his role as the Christian Voice Australia national spokesperson. Greg, thanks so much for another great update today on 2020.
Bless you, Neil, and thank you.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.